Thank you, Ed, and we will, thank the Minister as always. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici sur le territoire traditionnel des peuples algonquins, but I understand that you had also the great fortune to hear Sally Webster this morning as the elder's wise words about all of the work that she had done on beading and sewing and all of the things that we all really covet, I think, as Southerners, but without the skills to actually develop a business or be able to export or train others or the kinds of things that we all are talking about here today. So I too thank our host, the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, NACA, as well as the Public Policy Forum for, as the Minister said, recognize the necessity and the value of creating opportunities like this to explore not only the meaning of reconciliation, but how that partnership and inclusive growth means that we can't leave out the people who actually were here first, but have so much to offer when it comes to this. I was thinking this morning about being in a Igloolik once and having the chief and the leadership point to the ocean and say, this is plenty. That as opposed to all of the concerns that we've had in terms of inadequacies, that as the minister said, that the fish and the oceans and the ice were their areas of plenty. And so that I was thinking, as the minister was saying, that we have an obligation to help with the infrastructure, but also the training to be able to tap into that plenty that is the North. And this is really about how meaningful relationships and productive relationships are essential to this shared vision of Canada where all people can fully fulfill their potential and share fairly and fully in this country's prosperity. So it is about partnerships. And last night at the celebration of the Inuit Economic Development Association, we talked about the new math of 2 and 2 makes 5, or 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 makes 20. If you take the 6 organizations that have now come together with the amazing leadership of Clint and Patrick Rubin and the leadership of Dwayne in terms of how those development corporations will come together to be able to make a much bigger impact and have a much bigger chance at being able to make the kinds of investments and participate in equity with the future of the North. So when you think, and I think everybody in this room understands that the Nunatsiavut group of companies has taught us a great deal. I think in opposition, I remember meeting with Clint and Yvonne about, again, the issue of procurement and how that fake Indigenous companies are actually, unfortunately, able to secure sometimes contracts where there's some Indigenous partner in quotation marks who's paid to stay home, and that actually doesn't work in terms of what all of us are here gathered to do. Obviously, the Inuvialuit Development Corporation, the Kitikmeut Corporation, Saku Investment, Kitiktaluk Corporation, and of course Makivik. So, it's fun coming here. This is sort of like my Greenspon in a certain way because there's so many friends like Madeline and Clint and Ed, but that from Sarah Leo to Eva Ariak to again our fearless leader Nellie Cornway, who I can remember on one of my second trip north, I remember thinking, because as a physician I have to admit that economic development wasn't exactly my strong suit, and I had a lot to learn, and I still have a lot to learn. But it was at that time, as a brand new member of Parliament in 1997, that Shaughnessy Cohen decided there should be an Arctic caucus. And a number of us went north that first summer of 1998, and it was as the minister said, that our understanding of the North was Lauren Harris and A.Y. Jackson, and it was the majesty of the land and the water. But what we came to learn very fast, it was the dignity of the people, and it was the expertise of the people who knew their land and their water and their ice, and were actually working so hard to really be able to understand that Southerners needed to listen to them if we were going to get this right. And so having that initial love affair with the North, which I don't think anybody who's ever been North doesn't immediately fall in love with it and wonder what we can do. And when I was in Reykjavik last year, I told the story. I just recently been at the Maritime Museum in London for the Franklin exhibit, and there was this audio file of a 100-year-old tape of a Inuk man who was repeating what his ancestors had felt when the Franklin exhibit arrived in their community. And in 3 times in less than a minute, the guy goes, and their hats weren't attached to their coats. And then he said, and their hats weren't attached to their coats. And so what the point has been ever since is if Southerners think they know more about the North or Northerners, that we're going to get it wrong, because we didn't even know enough to attach our hats to our coats in the earlier days, or not have cloth coats. So it is a matter of the humility that it's going to take to actually have a real partnership. Because, it was, I think, 1975, even predating the fight for women's college. As a feminist, I remember reading Nellie Cornway's quote in Speaking Together, which was the Status of Women Department's book on women, but it obviously was truly about Indigenous people. She said, paternalism has been a total failure. And I think that's really what our government is coming to right those wrongs, that this can't be paternalism anymore. We continue to get it wrong. And we're spending a lot of effort now trying to right those wrongs. But unless we understand what a partnership really feels like, that it cannot be watered down paternalism. The settlers thought they had everything right, and they had it mostly wrong in terms of thinking 7 generations out, or listening to wise women, or all of the things that the settlers pre-suffragettes thought they had. And so you think of the strong Inuit women that now have led from even Mayor Redfern to Sheila that we've talked about, to Nellie, to Mary Simon, that this is a really important thing that we understand now, that it is, and so it's pretty thrilling to have Minister LeBlanc now as a true partner in this mission that we have about the quality of life, but the economic prosperity and the promise of Canada's North. And so some of you know I was a little bit worried about, having to split up this job, and then everybody said to me, "It's okay. You love him." And so I was very relieved that my partner in this is again 2 more voices at the cabinet table, together with Dr. Philpott. That this is again how the Prime Minister is organizing that these are big jobs, and that we get to do it together, and we get to only do it in the whole of government way, as Minister LeBlanc said, that whether it's the fishery, whether it's transportation, whether it's infrastructure, that we are really trying to do this in a whole of government way. And I think that we're feeling that we've got some real support at the cabinet table now, and that this is, and I must say that wasn't mentioned, the intergovernmental aspect of this is huge. And we are so grateful that we have a minister with titanium in his spine, who understands reconciliation but has the way with people, that we're going to get this thing done, as we believe that Section 35 rights are not optional. So it is, as is in the Prime Minister put into all our mandate letters, this is about recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. This is in the mandate letter of every single minister, and that we actually have to start from that basis of the recognition of rights. But we also know that when you include people in decisions, that's what inclusive growth means. When you include the people affected by decisions in those decisions, you get better results. And so that this is not only the right thing to do, it's the just best possible thing to do when you are actually doing deliverology, which is supposed to be on results, right? And so it is about how we go on. And so, reconciliation that you've asked me to talk about a tiny bit is, we know it's not a destination. This is going to be a journey. It's a journey in which we have to make amends for past mistakes and work in meaningful partnerships. But it means as we go along, we will continue to have to be corrected. There's a lot of really bad habits. And so a partnership means, and as we learn so many times, that this is a marriage, not a divorce. And that in any good marriage, you will continue to correct one another about the things that bug you, and the things that need to just, maybe we could do a little bit differently together. So it is, I think, I looked at the first meeting the Prime Minister had shortly after the election in 2015, a meeting with the President Abed and National Chief Bellegarde and President Chartier, and at which Nathan looked up and said to the Prime Minister, "Could you tell me why this agenda was only developed by Canada?" And it meant that immediately we were corrected, that what we thought was having a lovely meeting with the national Indigenous leadership didn't feel like a partnership already, and that we've had to fix that. And so I promise you the meeting this afternoon with ICPC is a co-developed agenda of the priorities of our partners as we work together in that way. And so it is about a partnership that feels like a partnership, and it's only our partners who can tell us whether this feels like a partnership or not. And so it is since then, I think that I was remembering about a breakfast meeting of the Northern Ministers, at which we were in Iqaluit, and we were invited to a breakfast the next morning, and it was on economic leakage. And I remember thinking, what on earth is that? Like, it really, I was thinking actually of my septic system at the cottage, and thinking, this is, surely we can find a better word for this, because clearly it was about the economic activity in the north was not staying in the north. It was literally going south. That the economic activity was not economic benefit for the north or for northerners. And so when, even in Churchill, where we heard that all of the tourism, the Tundra buggies and the Zodiacs all were owned by businessmen in Winnipeg. That these are things that now, as we think of tourism in the north, how do we make sure that that benefit stays in the north? And then at a cabinet meeting last year in St. John's, Zita Cobb spoke to us about some of the work that she's doing with the Shorefast Foundation, and I finally found a better word for economic leakage. She calls it economic nutrition. And in the economic nutrition, she has these cards that are about her fishery. Now, Fogo Island cod is worth more than filet mignon in Toronto restaurants. Her hotel, and her furniture and hooked rug, that you can see on the back of each of these cards for what people spend on these things, how much stays in the north. in that her decision was to make sure that the people of Fogo Island benefited by whatever she did up there. And so I think that that's one of the things that's exciting is for us now talk about economic nutrition to the north. And we found even at the meeting that Dom referred to, or a similar meeting that we had in Yellowknife and in Iqaluit, that people are talking about if we're going to build the infrastructure that's required, does the training go with it? So again, that Northerners are part of building that infrastructure and actually are there. And so it is I think, about all of us hearing from one another. And I think that it is, again, how we make sure that Northern communities are benefiting not only from the building of infrastructure, but the bidding on contracts and also in the procurement, as you say. So in August 2016, we appointed Mary Simon, as you know, as the Ministerial Special Representative on Arctic Leadership. And it was really important that we listen as we develop the basis for the Arctic policy. And so it was then shortly after that that on February 9th, 2017, that the Prime Minister signed the Inuit Nunangat Declaration, which was with the ITK as well as Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, Makivik Corporation, Nunatsiavut Government, and the Nunavut Tukavik Incorporated. And that was to show that there was a commitment by the federal government as well as the Inuit leadership to work on what we now lovingly refer to as ICPC, the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee. Now that committee will meet this afternoon, but it is again about how we set priorities together and how then we meet regularly to see how we're doing on those priorities, how the policies and programs are designed, and how we are honest with one another about how these joint efforts are evaluated. Are we winning or not? And how we deal, like in any partnership, about truth-telling. So it was based on the basic premise that an equal partnership between Inuit and the Crown would be essential to reconciliation. So as you know, when Mary submitted her final report called A New Shared Arctic Leadership Model, that she was pretty frank that until we could deal with poverty, people were having a little bit of trouble dealing with anything else. And so that all of us in the room know that economic development is very important, and shared economic development is very important to dealing with poverty. But those basic needs of housing and TB and all of the things that we are dealing with, are suicide, are very much a part of how we have to bring hope back to people so that they really understand what it means to participate in an economy. And so in the Arctic policy framework, the 6 things that were chosen were the comprehensive Arctic infrastructure, but strong Arctic people and communities, the strong, sustainable, and diversified Arctic economies, Arctic science and Indigenous knowledge, protecting the environment, and preserving Arctic biodiversity and the Arctic in the global context. The Inuit Crown Partnership is this afternoon will deal with Minister LeBlanc on the issue of the Arctic policy framework, including the chapter that the Inuit will write themselves. But we also will be dealing with things like the land claim implementation, the Inuit Nunangat policy space, health and wellness, the housing, education, early learning and training, Inuktitut revitalization, environment, and climate change. One of the things that I learned as a physician a long time ago, we talk about social determinants of health and we talk about healthy choices, but if people don't have a secure personal cultural identity, if they're not proud of who they are, the healthy choices are much more difficult. And so for us to make sure that the language and the culture is very much part of everything we do, we know that's the only way you really get results in terms of proud Inuit children and youth who can see themselves in their language, in their culture, proud of their ancestors and proud of their land and their water and their ice, and competent. So it is for us really important that we get going on all of these things, and it is about us also unfortunately having to secure and the redress for measures of historical grievances between the Inuit and the Crown. As you know, we made the Anderson apology for the residential schools. That was a very important part of reconciliation. Even though at the time Newfoundland and Labrador hadn't been in Canada, we felt it was still really important that we do that. And now we will deal with the TB as well as the relocation issues, and it is really having to deal with these long-standing and sometimes continuing injustices that we take these important steps forward. As we've heard from NTI, we actually have to deal with the languages as part of the land claim implementation, and we need that in order for the opportunity for people and communities to thrive. So it is, as Dom said, that when we think about co-development, we actually think about the North. We actually boast about the North when we're talking about co-development in the South, about how you take decisions on large projects. How do we make sure that land use planning is done in a way that actually takes always the voices of Inuit peoples as well as the territorial government as well as the federal government. But it is going to be hugely important as we build tourism industries, as we celebrated the highway from Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk, as we look to how we can make sure that good projects can be approved very quickly. Medium-sized projects can be sent back to the drawing board in terms of a better environmental approach or more jobs for Inuit, that we can actually, and bad projects can be rejected pretty quickly if Inuit are not in favor. So I just want to, in closing, talk a tiny bit about my concern that I think Clint and those of us that were in Reykjavik last year felt at the Arctic Circle meeting. There was a feeling from the southern countries that the Arctic is a common good. There was a feeling, I think, by all of us on when Japan hosted the opening reception with their drums and their sushi and their music, that there was something kind of wrong about this being an Arctic Circle meeting. But it really was that they felt that common good meant that all the southern countries should have an equal say on what happens in the Arctic. And I think Canada is taking a pretty strong view. This will be part of the Arctic Policy Framework. It's reason why there's a global perspective in the framework itself, because it is about our absolutely strong belief that Northern policy has to be directed by Northerners, and that means that here in Canada, opportunities like today are really important, but it is in all humility that we learn how to listen and learn how to actually respect the Inuit knowledge, the values, and it be feel like a real partnership with Northerners, so that we realize the long-term opportunities, build the strong people and communities, robust economies, sustainable environmental practices, but also international leadership in the Arctic. That means Northerners should have the say in what happens in the North, and that leads to our ultimate goal of reconciliation. Thank you. Nakamik Kuyanami.
Okay, so the minister is got about 5, 6, 7 minutes for a few questions, and if you put up your hands, I will acknowledge you. And we have one question coming over there right now.
Thank you. I want to talk about procurement.
Do you want to say?
And we know the tremendous potential it has for Indigenous entrepreneurs, for our Indigenous ECDF corporations. And I appreciate your candidness in talking about some of the challenges related to that, the fake companies, paying somebody to stay home. And that's on the supply side. But I want to talk about challenges on the demand side of that equation. And looking at the procurement strategy for Aboriginal businesses as it stands right now, it's voluntary. So there's no mandatory element for departments to participate. They could set targets. How is that measured? How are they held to that? They're not. It's voluntary. And experience has been, my personal experience, is that a lot of the departments are not signing on. There are several challenges on that demand side of the equation, including additional layers to the RFP process. Perhaps it's more lengthy. Perhaps the procurement people do not know the capacity that exists, or falsely think that the capacity in Indigenous communities does not exist to respond to such calls for tender. We've seen all of that happen. I work in civil construction, true story, trying to reach out to Transport Canada to market my business and talk about upcoming opportunities. My calls were not responded to, emails. A couple of weeks go by, I get a call from the Regional Office of Indian Affairs in Quebec City asking me what did I want from Transport Canada. I found that totally insulting, and in hindsight, I have to measure the opportunity cost, the time I invested in trying to make the procurement strategy work in my region or for my company. A tremendous loss. So my question to you, on the demand side of the PSAB equation, is what will you do in the next 6 months to ensure that federal departments take the responsibility seriously of making the existing strategy work while we look at other ways on how we can make it better? And how do we measure that accountability to bring real results to Indigenous economies? Thank you.
That's a great question, and I think that putting a 6-month sort of deadline on it is, really is important, because I think we should be able to do better, and I think we should be able to do better across all government departments. I think in some ways it's the reason the Prime Minister put Crown in my title last summer, I think, is that rather than just running INAC programs, that we actually have a responsibility across all government departments on the relationship, on the TRC's calls to action, on all of those things. And we need to do better. And so I think that we will commit to get a more coherent policy across all of government. But one of the things I've also heard, just in terms of your experience there with the Quebec office, is that the regional federal councils used to be much stronger. And over the previous government, they got sort of diminished in funding and in committee work and in all of the things that they were doing on reconciliation and on the Indigenous relationship. So I think that we're also looking to see that where the federal councillors and the regional directors general come together, that they could actually help one another fix these things locally, such that they don't have to come all the way up to one deputy, across to the other, and all the way back down. And so that's something that we've talked about and that we want to fix as well, because I think there's some things that people could just help one another in the region do a better job at these things, and particularly with procurement. And as you say, communicating the amazing capacity that exists, as opposed to the stereotypes, and getting rid of some of this just terrible misinformation.
Okay, we have time for one more question or two more quick questions. I have one there, one here. Oh, and if you go real quick, I can get all three of you in.
My name is Jessica Shadian, CEO from Arctic 360, and I wanted to maybe pick up on the comment you made about Jorn Klint's observation last year in Reykjavik about the Arctic Circle meeting, and this idea about, they think it's a global commons, and my perspective on that is, in fact, what is happening, because if you go to an APEC meeting, you have the European Union there. Right? So I think what's really happening is the Arctic is becoming a geopolitical hotspot, and I think what Japan is seeing is a huge economic opportunity, And they build ships, and there's maritime routes, and you have, China would like resources, and they also see the maritime possibilities there. And so I'm just wondering, and I really appreciate Minister LeBlanc's comments about in terms of investment and in terms of some of these big investments to ensure that Canada is in charge of its own space in the north, in terms of infrastructure and and how, what kind of, maybe the Arctic policy framework will put forward in terms of a plan for infrastructure development in the north.
Yes, I mean, I see it as a sovereignty issue, obviously, but also it's a matter of choice. And if Indigenous and Inuit companies want to partner with international companies, that's up to them. But it is, again, us understanding where the other countries are at in terms of their focus on these opportunities, and how do we get there first, or how do we have a rules-based approach that doesn't have Inuit or Indigenous companies at the back of the line. So, I think it is about a sort of affirmative action that we need to have in our domestic policy, but also keeping our eye to what's happening around the world. I mean, I think you're quite right. I mean, it seems that the Arctic Circle meeting is what in its genesis was to be the Davos of the North. But again, I didn't feel there that they really understood the need to have a preferential or a priority for northern countries.
That's all.
Hi, Shannon Matadawabin, National Aboriginal Capital Corporations. 20 years ago, I started as a business development officer helping Indigenous entrepreneurs start, and the INAC budget approximately was about 2% dedicated to economic development. It's now a lot later. We're still standing at about the same. And for developmental lending, and this is a common theme that's come from all three sessions that have been held in this space, is access to capital is still the biggest barrier. I know infrastructure, but access to capital, we're not going to see any business development unless we have options for access to capital. What is the Department of Indian Affairs going to do as far as economic reconciliation in that space of dedicating more to investing in the Indigenous community rather than the Band-Aids that have been going on?
So, I mean, I think it's a great question, and it's only going to be with your help and the help of your council that we come to the right policy decisions, policy levers. Access to capital also means credit ratings and again, economic development organizations. And so how much should government do? How much does it back up like it does with BDC or EDC or those things? What should be government money? What should be government backing other people's money? So, I mean, I think, it would be, I think we would really benefit from your advice.
And our final question.
Thank you. Am I on? Okay, good. Caroline, good to see you again. Last time I think we met in the elevator as you were leaving a meeting, but I think the board is looking forward. I'm Terry Ma with ITK, and I think the board is looking forward to the meeting this afternoon with you. There might be a few changes to your agenda already. But the question actually, Minister Blanc had raised things that were going on in terms of how Canada specifically was approving projects in the territories. Just a reminder too that Inuit encompasses 2 provinces and 2 territories, just to make sure that that's noted. And his presentation involved a lot of statistics specifically for the territories. And of course, you work with us on a very close basis, and you know that Inuit is not just the territories, and it includes our friends in Nunatsiavut and as well as in Nunavik. My question has to do more, though, with government programming, specifically Indigenous programming, that's meant for Indigenous people. And how do we measure the government, or specifically you, I think, or your ministry, because you have the Indigenous file in terms of the relationships. And it's been mandated that these programs become co-managed or that become transferred into the hands of specifically Inuit organizations to manage, deliver, lead. And you've made it great progress. The Government of Canada has made great progress in terms of labor market, in terms of childcare recently, and hopefully in post-secondary education. But when it comes to these broader economic development programs that are being administered by CanNor and other agencies and departments, there hasn't been much movement. How do we know that these great movements in other programs, how will we measure your success in moving those programs forward?
Well, in the partnership, it will mean that you will decide whether we're making sufficient progress or not, and you will help us chart the path. I think that as we know that even with the land claims agreements, that we're not moving as fast as we should on Inuit public servants, that eventually it should be Inuit that make those decisions at CanNor, I would say, or at least Indigenous people. That this is a work in progress, but I'm worried that on some of the issues, like creating great public servants, obviously as a physician, creating a health human resources strategy so we have enough doctors and nurses and midwives, but statisticians, epidemiologists, that we are going to have to do a proper strategy. And I think that on the language piece, that CanNor's, I think, done some good things on really trying to make sure that Inuktitut and that there is a capacity that it needs to increase. But no, we need to work with you on this, and we will, we particularly on economic development, how do you create entrepreneurs? How do you create the people who can understand risk? How do we cultivate people who can see an opportunity and then dive in and take that opportunity? And I think that probably as a country we've not done as much of that, but certainly I think in the Indigenous space we've got a lot more that we could do to support it.
Well, I want to thank you, Minister, for being here with us today. I think I'm mic'd already. I could be double mic'd. But I want to thank you for your generosity with your mic. I think it's important that we have this conversation, and you and Minister LeBlanc are with this group. But of course, it's an ongoing conversation, and when we leave this room, I think it's important that the minister needs to understand your issues. She needs to understand your realities on the ground. She needs to understand your solutions. She wants to feel your love, but she needs to feel your insistence, because when you're insistent, that helps her with her colleagues as well. So persist and insist, and hopefully we will achieve some success together. Thank you.
Thanks again, Ed.